This is the Living Vertizontal podcast, brought to you by The Church at Riverstone, a fellowship of the Church of the Nazarene in Madera, California. We are a podcast that discusses the intersection of Scripture and our lives. Together, we continue the conversation that was started each preceding Sunday morning in our worship gathering.
Hi, everybody. I'm Nick.
And I'm Natasha.
And we are the Living Vertizontal podcast with you this week to continue our journey through the Gospel of Luke together. As a quick reminder, this is actually going to be the last of our conversations on Luke for just a short time as we work through Lent. So next week, we'll start our Lent series. But this week, we are going to finish up looking at Luke chapter 12, verses 22 through 34. But before we get there, I just want to remind us of kind of where we've been. So last week, we were also working through Luke chapter 12. We looked at verses 13 through 21. And in this passage, Jesus shared the parable of the rich fool in response to a question, or what I called out a command from a member of the crowd. And as we worked through the interaction between Jesus and the member of the crowd, we came to recognize the misplaced focus of the rich fool of the parable. I believe Natasha multiple times just said he had a focus problem. And so not only is the rich fool nearsighted, he is also functioning in a very self-focused way. At no point does the rich fool acknowledge the reality or presence of God. From the parable, we hear Jesus calling them then and us now into deeper dependence on God in all things. In the words of Jesus, to live richly towards God. Practically speaking, this heart disposition walks in humility, both recognizing God as the source and also the one we should go to as we work to discern what we should be doing with what we have at each different moment. As I said, this week we're going to be moving on into Luke chapter 12, verses 22 through 34 together. And in this passage, we're going to be exploring Jesus' statement to his disciples to, quote, not worry. So, Natasha, would you read for us our passage for today, Luke chapter 12, verses 22 through 34?
Yes. Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will wear. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothes. Consider the ravens. They do not sow or reap. They have no storehouse or barn. Yet God feeds them. How much more valuable you are than the birds. Who of you by worrying can add a single hour to his life? So if you cannot do such a small thing, why do you worry about the rest? Consider how the lilies grow. They do not labor or spin. Yet I tell you, not even Solomon in all his glory was adorned like one of these. If that is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the furnace, how much more will he clothe you, O you of little faith? And do not be concerned about what you will eat or drink. Do not worry about it, for the Gentiles of the world strive after these things, and your Father knows that you need them. But seek his kingdom, and these things will be added unto you. Do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father is pleased to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the poor. Provide yourselves with purses that will not wear out, an inexhaustible treasure in heaven, where no thief approaches and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also."
All right. Thank you for reading that for us today, Natasha. As we move into this conversation, I think it's going to look a little bit different today. And by that, I mean, as we, Natasha and I, were kind of talking through what this podcast would look like and what we needed to address or talk about as we work through the passage, we came to recognize throughout our time in the church and engaging with people and like their engagement with Scripture, we've heard a lot of misconceptions or misunderstandings or maybe misrepresentations of what Jesus is, or what we believe Jesus is communicating here in this passage. And so we were thinking maybe it would be beneficial for us to work through these misconceptions as we work through this passage together today. So with that in mind, where are we going to start out as we work through these misconceptions together?
Well, I think the best place to start is probably with one of the misconceptions that I think bridges from last week's conversation as well. And so the misconception is Jesus here in this passage is condemning all planning or responsible provision. Now, we talked about last week a lot with regards to the foolish man,
Right.
and how he, planned, and his planning included tearing down his barns and building new ones. And on that podcast, we talked about how that really wasn't necessarily the problem. Like his good business practice, his good planning for the future wasn't exactly what the problem was. His problem was that he didn't consult or bring God into any aspect of that.
Right.
Now, and we gave some examples about how God has in our own personal lives, in our life as a church, has led us previously to plan.
Yep.
And he has shown faithful and showed us what that planning, in fact, was for.
Right.
And so it's not that planning in and of itself is necessarily the issue, but this can be an issue if it is. That's your goal. That's where your heart is.
That's where your focus is.
Yes. We want to make sure that our focus is always on Jesus and where it is that he wants us to plan. And so to have this understanding that Jesus here is condemning all planning or responsible provision really flies in the face of everything that we talked about last week. And so you might be wondering, well, why would somebody even think this? Well, when Jesus here in this passage says, do not worry about your life.
Right at the top.
Right at the beginning, people take this, even because we read scripture oftentimes in isolation. And so this is why it's so important to always go back. On the heels of the foolish man, we can come into this with context and say, oh, we know Jesus isn't saying what the misconception would say he's saying. But when you read that in isolation, do not worry about your life. Then a Christian could read this and interpret it to say, well, then I shouldn't plan. I shouldn't save. I shouldn't think ahead financially or otherwise, because I don't need to worry or bother with any of that.
Yeah, I think at the outset of this passage, right? So that this invitation or command, whatever you want to identify it as, of do not worry about your life, that happens in the first verse 22. However, just before that is the word therefore, which it is always, you already made the statement, like it's important just to hold things in context, but that is compounded in importance when you read a word like therefore, because Jesus himself is establishing that there's a bridge, there is a connection point between what I have said and what I am going to say. And yes, I think not just in the life of our church have we recognized that Jesus is inviting us to plan and prepare, but even last week as we worked through that conversation of the rich fool, we identified this isn't about Jesus saying you're not permitted to save or plan. Wealth was never the issue. It was the man's focus. We brought up Old Testament passage, right, with Joseph in Egypt. Mm-hmm. We brought up New Testament passage in James 4:13, right? That's a group of people who were planning to go to work. And so it's just that there's all these different avenues that people are planning to take. And really the issue that scripture takes with any of these is the focal point. What are the people focusing on? Whether they're choosing to sit in their wealth, where's their focus? Well, for the rich fool, it was on his wealth and his accomplishments and himself. For the people in James 4:13, where's their focus? The problem that existed in that passage is it was them who was dictating. Well, tomorrow we're going to do this. We're going to stay there for a year. We're going to conduct business. It was all their own idea, their own conception, their own focus on themselves. That is where the problem lies. And so this invitation that Jesus issues right at the top, connected with the therefore, is an invitation to recognize, to have a proper focus, right? It is continuing that exact same conversation. And we are going to continue that conversation even as we work through these misconceptions. And I think if we hold this idea of focus and where our focus ought to be, a lot of these misconceptions begin to unravel anyways.
Right, right. And then, we can take this the complete opposite direction, and we can kind of say that, well, as I trust in him, if I have faith in God, then he's always going to provide in abundance. And so there's this expectation that if I truly trust God, then we will always have plenty. And conversely, then, if I lack, it's because I have weak faith.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, I think this, again, carry this conversation on focus, right? This is a huge deal. But I look at this and I hear those statements, and I can understand the assertion, right? Because on the surface, we're reading these different statements throughout this passage where, it identifies like that Jesus cares for us even more than he cares for the ravens, and yet the ravens don't find themselves wanting, right?
Right.
He cares for us even more than the lilies, and yet Solomon in all of his splendor wasn't as beautiful as these things, right? So like it would be easy for us to just, if we just take it at surface level, to walk away and go, okay, so I'm never going to find myself wanting for food or wanting for shelter or wanting for any of that.
Yeah, but the truth of the matter is the New Testament is full of examples of faithful believers who really experience pretty extreme hardship.
Yes.
And want.
Right.
And so it would be amiss for us to assume that our faith in God is going to translate into abundant provision.
Sure.
And similarly, it would be amiss for us to assume that our lack of provision that we see in our life or our hardship is a result of our lack of faith.
Right.
Because the two do not always coincide. There's so many other factors at play.
And I think that this misconception actually betrays the problem of focus, because really when I think like I have when I expect abundance because I have faith, or when I think that my lack of abundance is because my lack of faith, that demonstrates that my focus is the now.
It's still a control issue, right? So you're believing that the provision is based on your faith. It's based on something you do or your lack of faith. So it's a result of my action, not a result of God's action. And again, that pulls us from the trust and the peace and the joy that full dependence, full reliance on God gives us. And Jesus is really trying to help shape and call his disciples into that kind of dependence, that level of dependence. So the anxiety and fear and all those things that Satan just wants to have these strongholds in our life to be able to pull on and nag at and just bring us down, destroy us, those can be replaced with love and joy and peace and all of these wonderful things that God wants to fill our lives with.
And as I think about like that misconception of how like our faith means that God will always provide in abundance, I feel like closely tied to that is like another misconception where like this teaching of, the ravens being provided for and the lilies and their clothed in riches, whatnot conversation. I feel like another misconception that kind of flows from that as well is this idea that Jesus is teaching passivity. He's telling people that they don't have to worry about actually doing anything in this life because it's going to be all taken care of.
Right. And I mean, this passage really is encouraging the activity of trust and living faithfully.
Right.
It's not encouraging inactivity.
Sure.
Right. The ravens still look for their food.
Right.
The
it's
lily
not like it just shows up one morning, right? On its doorstep.
The lily is still biologically very much at work, right? Undergoing photosynthesis and a whole bunch of other things that I could get excited about. But it's doing something. It's participating in, and we as Christ's disciples, we should be participating in the things that he is calling us to do. So that's not just a sitting back inactively watching, okay, well, let's
Life
see what
passes by.
Jesus
Yeah.
does next. We're just here for the ride, writing it into heaven. Jesus has a plan for us. He's got a purpose for us while we're here. And he's inviting us to live into that.
Yeah, I mean, all along throughout Scripture, as we've been watching Jesus's ministry, his invitation is an invitation to participation. It's not an invitation to passivity. It's not an invitation to just sit and wait for the kingdom to come. It's no, the kingdom is at hand, and now you're going to work with me, and we're going to walk side by side and usher this kingdom in through our active labor, through our active work. And this kind of teeters on a fine line, right? It would be easy to be like, okay, so then I am responsible for bringing the kingdom here in everything. Like I just work. No, Jesus is still responsible. However, Jesus is also desiring to use us and partner with us in this inbreaking of the kingdom.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we have worked with a number of volunteers, both as pastoral leadership, but also when we were lay people in the church. And along that journey, we've come across a number of volunteers that work well into their retirement age, right? The point at which some people kind of hang up the towel and say, I'm done. Jesus really can't use me anymore. I'm not relating to the kids the way I used to. They have all a myriad of excuses. But there's always a few, that continue to work faithfully and continue to be remain active participants on mission. And it's so noticeable. It's so obvious. And the statement of one of them at one point was, I'm going to keep working because God will let me know when it's time for me to sit by passively. He'll let me know because then I'll be dead, And so like the intention and the heart of this is,
right.
So long as I have breath,
I have a job to do.
Right. And we will have eternity to rest. We'll have eternity to rest. But right now, Jesus has called us to something we can't do after we die. Mm-hmm. And so don't waste a moment of it. Don't sit idly by. Jesus has called us to be active participants in his kingdom building. And that begins with our dependence on him. We can't do anything if we aren't dependent on him, if we aren't following him, if we aren't looking to him. And so it all comes back to our dependence, our reliance, our partnership with him to lead us into the next thing. And that's got to come through faithful trust in who he is and what he is capable and what he'll provide.
As we continue through this passage and kind of start to arrive at the end, there's a pretty extreme statement that is made. And I think that because of just how extreme this statement is, it's one that very easily can divide. Right. And misconceptions on both sides of this conversation, not just in one way or the other. And so that statement is the statement of verse 33, which is sell your possessions and give to the poor. And really the misconception is, one, this is a direct command. And so if we are a Christian, then we have to sell everything and give to the poor.
Yeah, it's a universal rigidity, right? Where every Christian really needs to take a vow of poverty.
Right. And so that's like one extreme. Mm-hmm. And then the other extreme is almost like a dismissiveness of this command, which is to say, oh, well, that was Jesus talking to them then. That's not really a message to us now.
Yeah, so it dismisses or minimalizes this command.
Right. And the problem with both of these, once again, is it misplaces the focus. Mm-hmm. Like the focus of this entire conversation is Jesus. The focus is following him and walking after him and listening to him and being prepared to lay anything and everything down. It goes back to the final verse of our passage from last week, where it was like that warning about how important it is to be rich toward God. And that doesn't mean and didn't mean like, okay, that just means you empty everything out and you just have nothing, but it means that you hold everything with open hands, ready to sell it, right? Ready to sell everything and give to the poor if that's what Jesus is asking of you for the purpose of his kingdom here and now. But that doesn't mean just go blanket sell it. You've got to find that balance, and that balance is found, and the heart of this passage is found when we come back to that conversation of focus.
Yeah, this one is such a hard one, but it goes back to this conversation we had years ago when we were going through the book of Matthew, and we talked a lot about legalism, and we talked about how legalism is easier because we have all these rules, and it's easier to just have a rule. So if I know I have to sell X percentage of my possessions to be in good standing with God, then I'm going to sell X possessions or X percentage possessions, right?
Yeah.
And so But the thing is, our world doesn't operate that way. God doesn't operate that way. He needs us to be faithful, obedient, and ready at every moment because every circumstance is different. Every situation is different. And you never know what he might call you to today that you might miss if you're holding too tightly to something. And similarly, if you hold too loosely and cavalierly with things, you never know what you might miss because he wanted to call you something to something tomorrow and you missed out because you weren't listening. You weren't being faithful with what he had provided. And so it really comes back to, as we've pointed out many times in this episode, your focus.
Yeah.
Your focus and attention has to be on Jesus. I trust you with everything. Show me what to do with the resources you've given me. Show me what to do with the lack of resources that I have in my life. Jesus, I trust you, whether in abundance, whether in much, whether in plenty, whether with nothing. I trust you.
Yeah.
And I trust you to show me how to use what I do have.
Yeah. And this may sound like an extreme example, but maybe extremes are necessary to kind of drive this point home. But it would almost be like one end of this misconception would say, okay, so I sell everything, right? And give it all to the poor. But then the day after I've sold everything and given everything to the poor, there's a man standing on the street corner in need of a jacket. But now I'm standing there naked and have no way to give him a jacket to keep him warm. What if in that moment Jesus was asking me, hey, I need you to give him a jacket. Oh, you ran ahead of me and you just got rid of everything. That's going to be really hard for you to be involved in this man's life right now, like I need you to do, right? So this like desire to have this rule or to live by this rule and have this rigidity, while it makes it easier in a way, right, to live in this life, when we have these rules and these guidelines in place, it also very well might result in us missing what Jesus needs from us to participate in his kingdom. And I mean, with that, I feel like this goes back to a lot of the conversation that Jesus was having when he was issuing the woes to the Pharisees and the Sadducees, when he was warning people to be aware of the leaven of the Pharisees. If you remember back to that podcast, and we talked about kind of the offhanded conversation where it's like, maybe this isn't necessarily what you would find in a theological exposition on this passage, but the identification that, man, the leaven of the Pharisees was inviting, it was enticing because it provided a clear understanding of what I had to do to have the right standing with God. And it was like the things to do, the to-do list and the not to-do list.
Yeah, it's a checklist.
And that is not what Jesus is inviting them into then, nor is it what he is inviting us into now. He was inviting them and us into a dynamic relationship of participation and interdependence. And you can't have that when you're living by religion or when you're living with such rigidity.
Right. And so as we press on, another statement that's made here towards the end is a comment that Jesus makes about treasure in heaven. He says, sell your possessions, give everything to the poor, provide yourselves with purses that will not wear out, an inexhaustible treasure in heaven where no thief approaches and no moth destroys. And the temptation by some here can be to misread this treasure in heaven, because we are talking so much here about resources and provision, and that finances and treasure is often tied to all of these material things. And so then we think, well, treasure in heaven is going to be, a material type treasure in heaven.
An extra jewel in my crown.
Right. So treasure in heaven means rewards earned by merit. So based on my achievement and how well I do here, how much possessions I sell on behalf of the poor, how well I stick to that checklist, right? Or, even how well I listen and obey Jesus.
Right.
Is then going to amount to
an extra room in my mansion or something.
Yes. And again, this goes back to that heart issue, that focus issue that Jesus is attempting to address. If your goal is to provide for yourself an extra jewel in your crown or an extra room in your mansion in heaven, this misses the purpose of our even being in relationship with Jesus.
Right.
Because that's not pure motivation. It's not what Jesus seeks for us. And so that's something that we want to watch out for creeping up inside of ourselves. Sometimes it can look like this self-righteousness, right? Which is what we saw so much manifested in the lives of the Pharisees
and the Sadducees.
They believed that because they adhered, and in fact, because they adhered so well to these checklists and laws, people admired them. They had treasure, right? That in value because of the way people perceive them. And people probably thought, wow, they are so holy. When they get to heaven, they're going to get to sit next to God, or they'll be in the throne room, And so there's just this warning that the treasure that we're saving up for in heaven, it's not about these material things. It's an eternal investment. It's kingdom-oriented living. It's alignment with God's purposes.
Yeah, because if I live in such a way that I believe that, what I'm doing is going to earn me more in the future, and so I start doing more so that I can have more in the future or in eternity, whatever it may be, I am no different than the rich fool that Jesus was warning about. Because while I'm not taking it easy in this life, I am doing things in this life so that I can take it easy later. My focal point is me, right? When I carry this misconception of I just need to do so that I can have, then I am making myself the center of attention. I am making myself the focus. And Jesus has again and again and again and again warned against this and invited them into a focus on him, a dependence on him, a surrender to him. And when we do that, this line of thinking just has no place in our life.
Yes. And so as we press on here to kind of conclude, we're going to have one more misconception that we address here. And I'm going to be honest, as I was reading this passage, I know who God is. I know his character, right? I know all these truths about him, but it's so hard when you look up at the world and you recognize all the evils, all the lack of provision. When I acknowledge the fact that right now in this world today, someone will probably die of hunger, of a lack of provision. And
lack of shelter. Yeah. Exposure.
What do we do with this, right? What do we do with this promise that we don't need to fear, that he will provide all of our needs, that he knows all of our needs, and that he wants to give us the kingdom, right? What are we to do with all of this? And so as I kind of sat struggling through this, it probably actually drove us to this conversation about the misconceptions. But really sitting with this, I kind of came to the reality that I had almost subscribed to this false narrative that if we're in God's flock, then hardship shouldn't happen. And this is inconsistent with what we've seen, right? This is inconsistent with experience, but we know this promise is true.
Yeah.
And so clearly there's a disconnect. Clearly we're missing something. Clearly I'm missing something. And so as I kind of looked deeper into this, I realized that there's actually a vulnerability when Jesus talks here about the little flock. When he says, "Fear not," this implies that the flock is susceptible, that it is vulnerable.
Yep.
We know that shepherds care very deeply for their flock, and yet there's all sorts of things that still take their life, that still demand it from them. And so I think the really, really important thing for us to remember here is that Jesus is not promising to remove all suffering.
Right.
He's not promising that our faith is going to remove all suffering.
Right.
We can have great faith and still experience hardship, suffering, and the evils of this world.
Yep.
Rather, what Jesus is offering is comfort in this very, very fragile world. He's not offering immunity from it.
Mm-hmm.
And the comfort that we have can only be realized when we trust and depend on him. And so our dependence and our trust on him it's bigger than the now. It's an eternal trust that Jesus has us held for eternity.
Yep.
And that he has us held for us to achieve his intended purpose here. And when that time is done, we can trust that he has us in death also.
Yes.
When those needs go unmet, when the provisions go unmet, when the prayers for healing go seemingly unanswered.
That's right.
We can trust that Jesus has us on the other side as well, and that's just the beginning of all that his kingdom has to offer. And it's so difficult because we only see so little. But again, the comfort that he's offering in this passage to his disciples, who we know are going to go on as a little flock, very vulnerable. Most of them, their lives being demanded from them. And yet Jesus knew that they needed the protection.
Yeah.
He was there with them. He provided comfort for them so that they could have confidence that even in their last moments, even as they knew their lives were being taken from them, they had comfort and peace and knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that they could trust that God had them.
Yep. Yeah, I feel like this conversation, there's a lot of pieces just going like pew, pew, pew in my mind right now, but I'll try to kind of work through them. This conversation takes me back to the be aware of the leaven of the Pharisees conversation, because immediately following after that, he says, like, don't be afraid of the one who can do harm to you now. The one who has power and ability to torture you, to harm you, to kill you. Don't be afraid of them, because their power ends at your death. But instead, you should revere the one who still has power over you even after death, right? This invitation to revere God, like recognizing that there's a limit to what humanity can do to me and against me, but there is no limit to where God is at in this picture. And it would be easy when you hold those two together to be like, well, there's no limit to the fear that I should have of God and be afraid of him because he's going to terrorize me. No, because in that same passage, it's immediately followed up with this mindset that God has got our back. God's got the disciples back. When they find themselves in those situations, God's going to be there to give them the words to say. It doesn't say he's going to keep them from death, but he's going to give them the words to say. He's going to be there to support them, to lift them up, to hold them. And then you go even further and you have this conversation today, and the same thing rings true. The thought that kept going through my mind was, yes, you brought up, like, he's giving this encouragement, and many of his disciples their life is going to be demanded of them. But Jesus is having this conversation with them, and he knows his life is going to be demanded of him. And yet he is still pointing them to have a proper focus. Jesus, I don't think any single one of us would argue that Jesus had a misplaced focus or Jesus lacked faith, and that's why he ended up on the cross. No, he ended up on the cross because of his focus, because of his faith in who God was.
Because of his dependence.
Because of his dependence. Because on his own, he was saying, let this cup pass from me. But in his dependence, he said, not my will, but yours. And so this conversation that we're having today, this identification of being the little flock does not negate the junk of this life. There have been so many atrocities that have been levied against people, and it would be easy to be like, well, where's God? How is God faithful? How is God trustworthy? How can we depend on him? God's promise was never the atrocities won't happen. But his invitation was continue to live into my kingdom and reflect my kingdom and focus on me in the midst of those atrocities. The cross was a major atrocity that the Roman government levied against thousands of people. It was the atrocity that Jesus experienced. He never said that atrocity was going to go away. It was an invitation to a different focus in the midst of those atrocities. And that's where we find ourselves today. Yes, undoubtedly, there are people who are dying of starvation right now. Undoubtedly, there are people who are dying as a result of exposure, so not proper clothing or proper shelter of some sort right now. That doesn't mean that God is not faithful. It doesn't mean that God is not present. It doesn't mean that God doesn't care. But in this life, regardless of the struggles that we might endure, whether it's something as direct as, dying of starvation or dying for things that we believe in, or just experiencing the worst that humanity has to offer, like the continuous invitation is an invitation to be a reflection of his kingdom and embody a life that is focused on him in the midst of all of that. Because when we do that, eternity starts now, not after we've died. Eternity has already begun when we are living in such a way that our focus is him, that our intentions are him, that regardless of the junk that we're facing, we have an eye for him. When we live in that way, eternity starts now. And other people get to witness that. Other people get to see that. Even if they're the ones that are levying those atrocities against us, they get to encounter Jesus in us and through us. And that is the hope. That is the beauty of this conversation that Jesus is having with his disciples right now. That is the invitation of participation that he is giving. And we are here today entering the season of Lent. Today is Ash Wednesday. And this is a day and this is a season where we are invited to reflect on our own mortality. But even greater, as we recognize our mortality, we are invited to recognize just how dependent we are on him. And so in this Lenten season, let's lift our eyes to the Good Shepherd, who is faithful, who is here, and who desires to lead us on a moment-by-moment basis.
Thank you for journeying with us over the past 7 weeks. Next week, we will again take a break from our journey through Luke, this time for the season of Lent. We will be using a devotional for the Lenten season entitled A Consuming Fire, and that devotional is available for purchase on Amazon. Be sure to follow the Living Vertizontal podcast to stay current on all our new releases. To learn more about the Church at Riverstone, visit us at thechurchatriverstone.org.